How's it going, you awesome bunch of bakers? Welcome to another video. Today we're comparing cold bulk fermentation against cold proofing. So let's go to the kitchen and get started. As far as I'm concerned, both these methods are the best for producing commercial yeast fermented dough. They are extremely simple and convenient. They produce a far superior tasting bread, and it is extremely easy to adapt your favorite recipes to be made with these methods. So we're not trying to find out which one is best here. In my opinion, they are both the best. But of course, I love making comparison videos, so we had to find out if there's any difference between them. So here's the plan. We'll make two breads containing exactly the same amount of ingredients: white bread flour, whole wheat flour, yeast, salt and water. The final temperature of both doughs will be exactly the same, and they will take exactly the same amount of time to produce, which will be around 16 hours from start to finish. The only difference is that one will be cold bulk fermented and the other one will be cold proofed. As ever, this is not a recipe video, so I'm not going to talk you through the steps here, unless it's relevant to the comparison. What we will talk about is the differences between the methods, and of course we'll compare the results in the end. I'm making both breads using the no-knead method, and if you are new to all of this, you can find detailed videos about these methods in the Principles of Baking playlist. There is a full detailed cold bulk fermentation guide, a cold proofing guide, a no-knead bread guide, and pretty much everything else you need to know about bread making. Well, let's get back to cold fermentation. What is cold bulk fermentation and what is cold proofing? Cold bulk fermentation is when you mix the dough, you pop it in the fridge, leave it to rise, and then you divide it, shape it and bake it the next day. So the initial part of the fermentation, which is before dividing the dough, is done in the fridge. Cold proofing is basically the opposite. You mix the dough, you let it rise at room temperature, you divide it, shape it, and then you place it in the fridge for the final rise. Both are slow fermentation methods. And as we know, the slower and longer the fermentation, the more flavor is developed. Using these methods really maximizes what we can get out of our flour. Okay, let's check back with our doughs for a second. They were both fully mixed. The one on the left was placed in the fridge. It is the one that will be cold bulk fermented. The one on the right will be cold proofed. That was left at room temperature for half an hour. I removed the cold bulk fermented one from the fridge to give it a fold. And I will fold the cold proofed one as well while I'm at it. Folding serves two main purposes. First is that it replaces kneading in this recipe. Second is that it equalizes the temperature of the dough, which is more important for the cold bulk fermented one than the cold proofed one in this case, because we want to cool down the dough evenly, and as it sits in the fridge, the outside gets cold while the inside is still warm. By folding, we distribute that temperature evenly throughout the dough. Okay, after the fold, I place the cold bulk fermented dough in the fridge, and it will stay there for the next 12 hours or so, whilst the cold proofed dough is getting its final shaping now, and that is after it's sat for another half an hour at room temperature after being folded. And yes, bulk fermentation in this case only took around 1 hour. I'm using 1% yeast, my kitchen is pretty warm, and I really don't want this dough to start fermenting too much before I shape it and place it in the fridge, because then I risk overproofing. And I guess that is the one downside to cold proofing. It can be slightly riskier, and it can be more difficult to save the dough if it's overproofed the next day. But if your methods are dialed in and you've done everything correctly, then it's not a big deal. Right, so final shaping done, I'll cover this up and pop it in the fridge next to the cold bulk fermented dough. Then on the next day, I'll do the final shaping on the cold bulk fermented one, I will leave it to rise at room temperature, and then I'll pop them both in the oven at the same time. One will be straight from the fridge, the other one will be at room temperature. As you can see, they have both puffed up quite well. I just wanted to show them side by side real quick, but of course the cold bulk fermented one still needs final shaping and final proofing. So the cold proofed loaf is going back into the fridge and it will only come out at baking time. And this gives us a good chance to talk about one big difference between them. The cold bulk fermented dough could be left in the fridge for another day, 2 or even 3 days, and sometimes even more. It'll still make great bread. But if I left the cold proofed dough in the fridge for 2 or 3 days, it might just break down too much. And while it may be possible to reshape it and let it rise again, that won't be the case for all bakes. Sure, it's fine for a plain loaf like this, but if you're making rolls, if you have something with a glaze on top, or if it's some cinnamon buns, there might not be a good way of reshaping those. So cold bulk fermentation is definitely more forgiving and it can give you more flexibility. And while I'm shaping the cold bulk fermented dough, it is also easier to handle. The dough is stiffer and easier to shape, especially if it's a high hydration dough. Now on the other hand, a cold proof loaf is easier to score, so there's pros and cons to each method. For me, it comes down to practicality. Forget the risk of overproofing, forget the fact that one might be easier to handle than the other. You can learn to control those things. But there is one thing that you might not be able to control. It's your baking schedule. It all depends on how busy your life is, and that is what will dictate which method you will use. Cold bulk fermentation is great for when you're busy in the evening. You come home after work, you mix your dough, you pop it in the fridge, you forget it. On the next day you come back late again, you pull the dough out of the fridge, you shape it, latterize and then bake it. And you can easily have freshly baked bread midweek on a busy schedule. Now on the other hand, if you have plenty of time in the evening, but not that much time on the next day, then cold proofing is the way to go. You mix the dough, you latterize at room temperature, you divide it, shape it, then pop it in the fridge, ready to be baked on the next day. And this is the ultimate method for breakfast bakes, because all you need to do in the morning is pop the bread in the oven and wait for it to bake. I use cold bulk fermentation for midweek bakes, and I use cold proofing for weekend bakes. Okay, our loaves are ready. We'll leave these to cool down, but we're not quite done yet. I decided to make another loaf for comparison's sake. This will be made using the same exact ingredients, and the no-knead method, and the same final dough temperature. The only difference is that this will be fermented fully at room temperature, so it will only take about a couple of hours, while the other two took around 16 hours to produce from start to finish. And the method here is the same. We mixed it, we latterize, we give it a fold, we latterize again, we do the final shaping, place it in a tin, latterize and bake it. This kind of quick fermentation will of course produce the mildest tasting bread. It won't have that much character. This kind of bread is best eaten warm from the oven, because when it cools down, it is quite bland, especially if you are used to eating breads made with slow fermentation methods. As you can see from the outside, it looks quite similar to the other two, and now it's time to compare them side by side. I was really curious if there would be a difference in flavor between the cold bulk fermented one and the cold proofed one. The crusts on them look slightly different. The cold proofed loaf in the middle has a slightly uneven crust. The cold bulk fermented one is nice and smooth, and that's most likely because the cold bulk fermented one was degassed, shaped, and only spent another couple of hours before being baked, whilst the cold proofed loaf spent a lot more time fermenting after being degassed and shaped, so it had more time to bubble up again. And that's where we can clearly see the difference in crumb structure. The cold proofed loaf has a more open crumb. It looks more irregular, while the cold bulk fermented one has a tighter crumb, which is more even. Now I personally don't care that much about the crumb. For me, taste is the most important thing. And to be honest, I was quite surprised. Both cold fermented breads tasted exactly the same, at least to me. And I guess it makes sense because they spent the same amount of time fermenting. And of course the quick fermented loaf on the right was quite bland and uninteresting compared to those two. As I said earlier, the main difference is practicality. Use the method that suits you best, because the end result will be pretty much the same no matter which method you use. Cold fermentation has completely changed my bread making forever, and if you try it, it might just change it for you too. So what do you think these methods? Which one's your favorite and why? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.